Hello. Hello. And a very good afternoon to you all. Welcome back. It's a pleasure for me to introduce the second day of an international symposium on Gustav Metzger entitled The Need for Art to Change the World, organized by the Department of Art and Media at DKM. Thank you, Laura, and thank you, Svetlana, for this. Following to a most enlightening day yesterday with Christian Steil's powerful and deeply moving opening conference, a thorough analysis within Gustav, followed by the conversation with the outstanding hero artist Ivor Davis. Today at 7 p.m., it'd be my honor to be in conversation with Andrew Wilson, Senior Curator, Modern and Contemporary British Art and Archives at Tate Britain. And before then, at 5 p.m., Jonathan Benthall will give his lecture remembering the Zagreb Manifesto 1969. And as for now, it is with great pleasure that I will introduce Catherine Mason, who will be giving the talk entitled Shouldering the Task of the Century, Gustav Metzger and Computer Art. Catherine is an art historian and author who specializes in digital art, especially computer art. She was born in Australia, brought up in the United States, and educated in the United Kingdom. Mason's special interest is the history of computer art and digital art. In 2002, she joined an Art and Humanities Research Council research project, CASH, Computer Art, Context, Histories, etc., at Birkbeck College. This resulted in a co-edited book, White Heat Core Logic, published in 2009. Catherine Mason also assisted in the reformation of the BCS Computer Art Society. She negotiated with the Victoria and Albert Museum V&A in London concerning donating an American collection of international computer art, the Practic Prints Archive. This helped to develop the computer art collection at the V&A. During 2011 and 2014, she produced a monthly column concerning digital art for the BCS. She has advised on digital arts to organizations including the Art Fund, the BCS, Leonardo, SIGGRAPH, and a number of museums and galleries. In 2008, she authored A Computer in the Art Room, based on 4 years of research and interviews. It uncovered the history of early British computer art and looked into, among so much, Gustav Metzger's relationship with art, technology, and computer, and Page, the Bulletin of the Computer Art Society. Gustav was the editor of Page from 1969 to 1972. It offered Metzger an ideal platform not only to publish his own writing, but also to voice both immediate and lasting concerns and highlight causes he campaigned for. This and much more shall enter Catherine's most anticipated talk. Welcome.
Thank you very much for having me, Matteo, and for all the good organization on the part of the art school. Very, very impressive art school here. Well, I'm going to start with this quote by Gustav. He paraphrases this statement by Laszlo Mahoney Nagi, the Hungarian constructivist artist and Bauhaus professor, written in an article in 1969 in Student International. And for me, it sums up several important things about Metzger: his belief in the possibility of art and artists as an integral part of society, and art that has a power to actually move society away from annihilation, potential annihilation by nuclear weapons, and his belief in the ability of technology harnessed for the good of mankind to get us there. So we heard yesterday from Ivor Davis about Metzger's unusual attitude to science and his love-hate relationship with it. But I would argue that Metzger's computer art becomes a way for him to assimilate his ambivalence to science. Now, Mahoney Nagi actually wrote, "This is our century, technology, machine, socialism. Make your peace with it, shoulder its task," in 1922 in Constructivism and the Proletariat. He continued, and I quote, "Because it is your task to carry revolution towards reformation, to create a new spirit that will fill the empty forms cast by the monstrous machine." Mahoney Nagi was part of a political movement which believed in turning away from the bourgeois conventions of salon-based fine art in order to reimagine the use of technological media. Such an art could be seen as being in solidarity with industrial workers, I quote, "seizing the means of production." Mahoney Nagi saw the place of the artist as being to offer moral guidance to the forces unleashed by technology. And Metzger paraphrased this quote by Mahoney Nagi in an article here called Automata in History, published in March 1969. He types on the bottom of the page there. Reprints of this article were given out to visitors at Event 1, the Computer Arts Society exhibition held that month. Metzger writes, and I quote, "The article deals with the most critical topic in technological art, the responsibility of the artist for his material and to society." Metzger wants an art that will engage with the public. He argues that the Bauhaus reputation is due a major revision, in his words. And ultimately, he says the Bauhaus failed in the aim of social change because the combination of art and technology alone was insufficient for the task. And indeed, by supplying good design, quote, it helped to cement capitalism, in his view, enabling manufacturers to increase their profits. So how did Metzger move from painting abstracts influenced by David Bomberg in the 1950s to defining a new aesthetic using technology fused with his agenda of social engagement in the space of only 10 years? And what did that work entail? Well, these are two of the things I would like to address in this session this afternoon. And I'm going to argue that far from being a peripheral activity, Metzger's computer art was at the very center of his ethos and practice. In the 1960s, his involvement with the nascent Computer Arts Society, in fact, helped to define its shape and character and direction. Metzger's use of the computer heralded the collaborative, cross-disciplinary nature of working, which came to signify the early period of media arts in Britain. Interactivity and process were as equally valued as object at that time. A recent exhibition at the Fermoy Gallery at Kingsland in Norfolk got me thinking about this. This displayed some newly discovered works from the 1950s by Metzger, paintings, when he was living in the town of Norfolk. And I think that in order to understand how Metzger developed his ideas, we need to go back to the 1950s and his time in King's Lynn. He arrived there in 1953 after a break with his mentor David Bomberg in London. And in the 1950s, King's Lynn was very much a quiet country town with around 25,000 inhabitants. That's against about 40,000 today. In the eastern part of England, the great river Ouse, as you can see there, runs through the town and empties into the sea at the Wash, which then empties into the North Sea. The town's historic livelihood is therefore bound up with maritime trade. For example, during the Middle Ages, it was the most important port in the whole of England. And for centuries, the main social event was the Tuesday market, founded in 1146. By the 1950s, this market was absolutely flourishing. And here you can see a contemporary photograph of Tuesday Marketplace, which is sadly now a car park. But this it still is a very large square. And much of the historic architecture remains, including the original 19th century Corn Exchange and the Duke's Head Hotel, which you're looking at here, which dates from the 1680s. Now, Metzger initially supported himself by running a market stall and selling bric-a-brac, books, and repairing furniture and miscellaneous items. And I have met older residents in the town who recall him going about collecting items in a barrel and a handcart to sell in the market on Tuesdays. Middle-class ladies would also give him items to sell as an act of charity, pots and vases and bits of china and so on. On Saturdays, he went to nearby Cambridge by rail and ran a used bookshop, used bookstall on their market. And at this time, he was doing works like this. This is about 1956. Paintings often produced on found supports, so pieces of cardboard, magazine, newspaper pages. And this piece is from the Radio Times, listing of television programs. In fact, a later exhibition in 1959 called Cardboards, selected and arranged by Gustav Metzger, displayed cardboard from television packaging without any painting on them as a sort of type of ready-made. As we know, Metzger remained interested in newspapers both as material and as process for art throughout his career. At one point saying, newspapers are reality, they represent reality, they also shape reality. By 1956, he had a shop called 30 Queens, which was in Queen Street, selling antiques, books, drawings, paintings, and sculptures. But sadly, this building does not survive. Here he put up posters in the window, promulgating his thinking on art, and mounted small exhibitions of his friends. And this is an article from the local newspaper written by Metzger about an exhibition he mounted in 1956, including works by Edoardo Paolozzi, Anthony Hatwell, and William Turnbull. Paolozzi and Turnbull were members of the independent group, Hatwell was a student of David Bomberg's, and you can see a bust by Hatwell just there. I'm sorry, the photograph isn't very good. It's been reproduced from microfiche. And then this is one of Eduardo Paolozzi's pieces there. And Metzger wrote of Paolozzi's piece, and I quote, "This black figure is made up of steel girders against which life struggles barely triumphant." Of another Paolozzi work, Head Looking Up, Metzger wrote, quote, "An image of a man battling with indomitable will against a mechanical, hostile environment." You can read the whole of the article in Matthij's book. It is also known that he displayed posters from the This Is Tomorrow exhibition at the Whitechapel Gallery in London in 1956. This was an inspiring exhibition as he made several visits. This Is Tomorrow was a groundbreaking exhibition, a collaboration of artists collectively known as the Independent Group. They were among the very first artists in Britain to consider the implications of science, new technology, and the mass media for art and society. And this is the poster from their exhibition. Meeting in the early 50s, the Independent Group was a group of visual artists and architects, theorists and critics, and they included Richard Hamilton, Rayner Banham, Eduardo Paolozzi, Peter and Alison Smithson, Theo Crosby, and others. Many of these artists had become familiar with technology during the war, and they shared an interest in the critique of modern life through interdisciplinary means. They were inspired by Scientific American, the science of cybernetics, Claude Shannon's information theory, von Neumann's game theory, and Darcy Wentworth Thompson's book On Growth and Form. But of particular importance for the incubation of computer art in Britain is their exhibition, This Is Tomorrow, which was a model of collaborative art practice. One of the key themes of this show was design and communication and the breaking down of traditional divisions in the arts. The artists believed, and I quote, "This limited their efficiency and made collaboration difficult," unquote. The catalog of this show, and you're looking at the outside of the catalog here, contains the very first published reference in Britain to the possible use of computers in art. And here's the inside of the catalog, section 12, presents a chart detailing the potential tools and methods of practice. So as well as traditional methods, such as marks, physical objects, arranged in or on hands, operated or produced by stick, chalk, pen, pencil. We also have, further down the list, objects, punched tape, cards, counter wheels, magnetic surfaces, wired tape and discs, arranged in or on punched card machines, desk calculating machines, machinery, operated or produced by motor and input instructions. And a few pages later, the authors credit Edmund C. Berkeley and the concept of giant brains. Here is the key to these artists' new way of thinking about art production. Berkeley was an American who published a book called Giant Brains or Machines That Think in 1949. And this book was really both a primer and a manifesto. He describes concepts such as binary and input and output. And often this is the first time that people in kind of general population in Britain heard about these concepts. And so this chart from This Is Tomorrow catalog actually reproduces a very similar chart that appears in Edmund Berkeley's book, but of course they transpose artistic methods and methodology instead. So we can see that these young artists had a strong belief in the power of modern technology, even emergent ones like punched cards, for which the exact artistic employment cannot possibly yet have been fully clear. And it's also worth pointing out that this chart has been done by hand and typed, and those lines are hand drawn. So they're talking about using technology that they haven't even seen, let alone able to actually access. But as I say, this is very exciting because this is the very first published reference that I can find in Britain to the use of computers in art. Now, Metzger's home in Kingsland was to the rear of an old building, St. Nicholas House in St. Nicholas Street, where he lived without paying rent. And you can see it here. Parts of this building date from the late 15th century. And also part of this building, this section here, was lived in by clergy during Metzger's time. Now, after Metzger's time, this was converted into a hotel, and it is now being converted into townhouses. And you can see here his studio at the back of the property. And again, when I was there photographing, the conversion was underway and the builders were in. I had to sort of wheedle my way in there by begging them to let me in and have a quick photograph. So this whole portion now is going to be completely turned into townhouses. Well, following the founding of CND, the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament in London in 1958, Metzger established a local CND group campaigning against rocket bases in East Anglia, of which there were many in this region. This was left over from the Second World War, and they were in use during the Cold War as well. So it was here in Kingsland that he refined his ideas of how art can be socially engaged, laterally experimenting with his very first autodestructive artwork. And this is a photograph of him in his Kingsland studio, and you can see some of the cardboard pieces around him, some of the supports for paintings at this stage. And here's a work from 1958, which is an abstract painted on a piece of found board, an old piece of a Kodak film box. Well, it was here in Kingsland that two events occurred which had a great impact on Metzger's development as a person and as an artist. He later said, "Everything I know about activism, I learned in King's Lynn." And the first was an exhibition he organized in 1957 as part of the King's Lynn Arts Festival, Treasures from East Anglian Churches, which consisted of sacred relics. And this exhibition was held at a 14th century merchant's house known as Clifton House, which thankfully still does exist today. And it is located opposite where his antiques shop was in Crown's Yard. Now, this exhibition was held in the undercroft space of the house, a sort of lower basement area. This merchant's house was historically owned by wine merchants who would have used this basement area to store barrels. And the town of King's Lynn in its heyday, don't forget, was a major center for wine importation into England. Now, the catalogue states that one of the aims for this show was to make the public more widely aware of the historic medieval architecture of the town. And the King's Lynn Festival still goes today. And back in Metzger's day, it was really very important, famous festival. People came from London to visit, and royalty attended it. I have to say nowadays it is not quite so famous, or I don't suppose royalty come anymore, but it still goes. It's been uninterrupted since this time. So Metzger traveled throughout East Anglia, collecting sculpture and stained glass, including Romanesque gargoyles from Norwich Cathedral, and an angel head in colored glass, and an ancient stone cover from a heart burial in a church in Peterborough. Many of the items on view were mutilated or defaced during the English Reformation or by Puritans. English Protestants in the 16th and 17th centuries sought to purify the Church of England of Roman Catholic practices. And this often meant that religious images in stained glass or statues and so on were defaced or scratched out, as you can see here. These are some angels in Barton Turf Church in Norfolk. I show this just as an example of how the faces were scratched out. This was state-sponsored destruction, and that it affected every single community in Britain because parish churches and cathedrals alike were stripped of their religious images. But I think the major point here is that we're talking state-sponsored destruction. Other items that Metzger did actually have on view in the exhibition is this angel head. This is from the church at Stratton Strawless, which is about an hour and a half's drive from King's Lynn. And this angel head is all that survives of the entire figure. So the rest of the glass figure probably would have been smashed, just the head is left. And the head probably survived simply due to chance. Also on view in Metzger's show was this head here, a crowned head from Fen Ditton Church in Cambridge. And again, this is a piece of the original fabric of the church, which would probably have been ripped off. Whilst this demonstrated the effects of violence and destruction on artifacts, Metzger was also refining his ideas about the role of destruction in creation. It has been suggested that in Metzger's eyes, these relics, rather than being diminished by being defaced, had actually acquired a greater symbolic value as a result of the destruction. And I think it's this exhibition that marks the beginning of his interest in the relationship between destruction and creation in England. Now, alongside this, a shocking thing happened to his neighborhood. And this was to be his first major political event, although ultimately it proved to be a source of sadness as he felt he had failed. And that, of course, is the North End protest. Now, opposite Metzger's house is an ancient church, St. Nicholas Chapel, which was started construction in 1380. And this is in an area known as the North End. Metzger would have known this area very well. The church is literally opposite the street from his house. And it's the North End is a very close-knit community, or was a very close-knit community, of fishermen. And the built environment centered on St. Nicholas Chapel, which is there. Pilot Street is the main thoroughfare here, and Metzger's house is approximately there. So Metzger would have known the people who lived there and the whole environment, which included small cottages, pubs, inns, a bakery, smoke houses. Most of the fishermen were inshore fishermen, which meant that they didn't go out into deep sea. So they fished for shrimp and herring and cockles and mussels and samphire and things that they could catch in the wash. Metzger recognized the great culture and heritage of this area. He believed that the community to be 800 years old. And there is a strong culture from this area, which was recognized. In fact, the English composer Vaughan Williams visited Kingsland, the North End area of Kingsland, to collect old folk songs, which had a marked influence upon his music. Here you can see two North End brick cottages dating from 1790, which consist of 2 rooms, one downstairs and one upstairs. These 2 remain today as part of a local museum. Well, in 1957-58, the Borough Council decided to construct a new road, which would necessitate the knocking down of the buildings of the North End and the destruction of this community. And Metzger takes up the cause, starting the North End Society to campaign against this. Now, this was part of the modernization of the town and the so-called slum clearances of the 1960s that happened all over urban Britain, throughout whole of Britain. This was also to facilitate, with regards to Kingsland, it was also to facilitate modern transport getting to and from the docks much more easily. So this self-sufficient fishing community consisted of hundreds of families with their own boat builders, chandlers, sail makers, dairies, and a school. And they led a very hard life often with no running water, no electricity, no drainage, and very limited cooking facilities. And here we have a photograph from the local paper showing Metzger in Pilot Street discussing the proposal with the president of the Chamber of Trade under the heading Conflicting Interests. Metzger calls for the area to be preserved as residential and to keep its character, arguing that if it was renovated, it would look less like a slum. And he suggests in the article that the council paint the houses, for example, just simple things. Now, I remember Metzger as being a very quiet, softly spoken person when I met him in the early 2000s. So I think having to put himself forward in the public eye like this really demonstrates his passion for this cause. So the heart of the North End community, as I said, was Pilot Street, which is where they're standing here when this photograph was taken. And it's the main thoroughfare that goes down to the wash. Over 300 people lived in Pilot Street. And here you can see the same house that still stands today that Metzger was photographed in front of. So there it is again, and there it is now. Sadly, despite the work of Metzger and others, the campaign failed and the John Kennedy Road was built. And in this picture, you can see the old and the new. So here's the end of Pilot Street, or the end that remains. And you can see the cobbled road, Ray, just ends, literally stops there. And then these are the 1960s houses that were built instead. So the old and the new. So all that remains of the North End were a few cottages that I showed you earlier on that exist in that museum, True's Yard Museum, and about a third of Pilot Street, the edge of which you can see here. But everything else on that original map has been swept away. However, this failure of politics led Metzger to turn his attention to the power of art to create social change. He made his first autodestructive artwork here, painting with acid onto nylon in Kingsland, and he would return to this technique throughout the 1960s, and most importantly in public settings. At his acid action painting event in 1961 on the South Bank, London, he attacked a canvas 7 by 12 foot sheet of nylon with an acid-filled spray gun, and the resulting almost instant corrosion being a visceral demonstration of the power of his autodestructive concepts. His statement of 1961 in the manifesto says, and I quote, "Autodestructive art is an attack on capitalist values and the drive to nuclear annihilation," end quote. And I think this references not only events he witnessed in the North End, but also his increasing concern with the nuclear threat. Shortly after the destruction of the North End, Metzger moved to London and develops a type of art that he calls public art for industrial societies. And this art will use the actual methods and materials of our industrialized society. and he lays out his ideas in the famous manifestos, the first of which is dated 1959, and which he says, and I quote, "The artist may collaborate with scientists, engineers. Self-destructive art can be machine-produced and factory-assembled," end quote. These manifestos contain some of the first references in Britain to the use of computers as possible materials and techniques in art. He, of course, also lists cybernetics as among the techniques to be used. With the study of cybernetics, the artist was able to move from oil paint to the use of cybernetic principles of feedback, control, and communication, and combine this with his social ideals for a public art. During the 1960s, interest in cybernetics and new technology was informed by this nascent science. At this point, computers were at an early stage in their development, commonly thought of as number crunchers, and often referred to as electronic brains. So not only was it difficult to access this type of equipment, at this stage it was difficult to perceive of the computer as being an art method or material at all, let alone one with any capacity for interactivity. But cybernetics, the science of cybernetics, showed artists a way forward. So the discipline of cybernetics in the modern sense of the word was coined by a mathematician at MIT in the late 40s, Norbert Wiener, in his seminal book of 1948. Cybernetics, or the control and communication in the animal of the machine. According to Wiener, at a basic level, cybernetics refers to the set of problems centered about communication, control, and statistical mechanics, whether in the machine or in living tissue. Now, Wiener's concept was that the behavior of all organisms, machines, and other physical systems is controlled by their communication structures, both within themselves and within their environment. The result of this book was that the notion of feedback penetrated almost every aspect of technical culture in Britain at this time. And this concept had a profound impact on artists by giving them a framework within which they could consider new technologies as an art material. Now, in the UK, the concept of using computers in art started in a sympathetic social and political climate. And this is evidenced by Prime Minister Harold Wilson's so-called white heat government, which was created to promote industrial efficiency and the use of new technology in industry. At the 1963 Labour Party conference, Wilson set out Labour's plan for science, promising a Britain that was, quote, "forged in the white heat of this revolution, with no place for restricted practices or for outdated methods." Science and technology was seen as an engine of progress, a driving force for industrial innovation and economic prosperity. Post-war expansion of science funding was massive. Government expenditure in 62-3 was 10 times that of 45-6. And at least half of this outlay was on technology that had not existed before the war. Now, the great interest in cybernetics and art in Britain culminated in the exhibition Cybernetic Serendipity at the ICA in 1968. And this was the first comprehensive international exhibition in Britain devoted to exploring the relationship between new computing technology and the arts. It was opened by Tony Benn, Harold Wilson's Minister of Technology. And it drew together leading artists from around the world. 325 participants covered a range of disciplines, including painting, plotter drawing, dance, music, animation, poetry, film, sculpture. It is still considered the benchmark computer art exhibition for its influence on many pioneers, as well as introducing the subject to a wider audience. And here you can see a work by Nicholas Schoeffer, and just the edge of a piece by Gordon Pask called Colloquy of Mobiles, which I'll come back to. Uniquely in the UK, in a gallery setting, Cybernetic Serendipity featured collaborations between artists and scientists and showed these to be on an equal footing. The breaking down of barriers between disciplines was an important factor. Machines were shown alongside artworks, and no differentiation was made between object, process, material, method, nor between the backgrounds of makers, whether they were art school educated or not. One of the aims of Cybernetic Serendipity was to show the scope of what was possible by emphasizing the optimistic and celebratory nature of the project. Although it must be remembered that its subject matter was very avant-garde and presented a topic and style of artwork that was outside of the mainstream of British art at the time. Cybernetic Serendipity was facilitated and inspired by a post-war spirit of optimism in the positive power of new technologies. This was an enormously influential exhibition upon what might be termed the second generation computer artists who saw it when they were very young. Here you can see a work by Edward Ignatovich called Sound Activated Mobile. Well, Metzger wrote in Studio International criticizing cybernetic serendipity. He complained the exhibition provided, I quote, a perfectly adequate demonstration of the reactionary potential of art and technology. No end of information on computers composing haiku. No hint that computers dominate modern war, that they are fast becoming the most totalitarian tools ever used on society. We are faced by this prospect. Whilst more and more scientists are investigating the threats that science and technology pose for society, artists are being led into a technological kindergarten, end quote. And here you can see Peter Zinofiev's pioneering electronic musician. He installed a music studio, an electronic music studio in cybernetic serendipity, and this is some of his music at the top, some of his computer-produced scores. Well, in the cybernetic serendipity accompanying publication, Gustav prints a diagram and an information for what he calls his biggest project ever proposed. And that is, of course, 5 screens with computer. Before this, he had actually written that autodestructive and autocreative art aim at the integration of art with the advances of science and technology. The immediate objective is the creation with the aid of computers of works of art whose movements are programmed and include self-regulation. And of course, that's a direct reference to cybernetics. He goes on in the third manifesto, he emphasizes science and technology as an actual artistic medium and says certain machine-produced forms are the most perfect forms of our period. And his plan for such a work was the computer-controlled public artwork, 5 screens with computer. It was very ambitious in concept and scale. The precise details of the operation of this massive interactive work vary, but in essence, it consisted of 5 walls or frames, 40 foot long, 30 foot high, 2 feet deep, spaced about 25 feet apart. At one point, he wrote that 5 screens was to be located in, quote, a very densely populated block of flats in a country setting. But here in the Cybernetic Serendipity publication, he writes about it being sited in a central place between large blocks of flats. And again, we have to remember that the tower blocks of social housing were being built across urban areas of Britain in the 1960s, again, as a result of the slum clearances. In any event, it's important to note that the work was cited somewhere in the public realm, because as he stated in his second manifesto, quote, autodestructive art is the transformation of technology into public art, end quote. And that it was intended to reflect and reference the inhabitants' lives, indeed form part of an integral part of their environmental experience. In the manifestos, Metzger had stressed the importance of the spectator having a direct bearing on the action of the works via the use of electronic devices. And this would give them some control over the events of the sculpture. Again, I think this can be seen as a reaction to Metzger's experiences of the North End in Kingsland, where residents had no control over the changes to their built environment. Each of these walls was to have 10,000 uniform elements made up of steel, glass, or plastic that would eject from the walls at intervals based on feedback from the nearby inhabitants. And it was ultimately set to destroy itself, so the walls gradually disintegrating and the whole thing ceasing to exist over a 10-year period, at which point he says the site could be reused, for example, as a park. At his AA lecture in 1965, he said, and I quote, "Society is deteriorating, so is the sculpture." By bringing destruction to the public realm through art, he hoped to rechannel the destructive power of computing technology, thus causing people to reflect on their lives, where society is heading, and even to serve as a sort of mass therapy. 5 screens was a hugely ambitious project which would have been highly costly to implement due to the computing power that it would have been required to run it, and indeed the potentially dangerous elements involved and health and safety implications. So probably for these various reasons, it remained unrealized at his death. At this time, Metzger also became an early member of the Computer Arts Society, which I'm going to call CAS from now on, the Computer Arts Society. It was conceived in 1968 in the wake of cybernetic serendipity, and it was officially launched in 1969. And here you're looking at the brochure of the Computer Arts Society, made in '69. CAS was the first practitioner-led organization in Britain created to promote the creative use of computers in the arts. It provided encouragement, inspiration, and support of a technical and occasionally financial nature. And perhaps most crucially, it had access to expertise and equipment. Because, and this is very important, the group contained participants from technical and scientific backgrounds as well as artists. So it was a true collaboration. Remembering this time, Metzger told me in 2003, quote, that he was excited to discover CAS and people coming together because previously he had felt quite isolated. And here you can see his membership form dated April 2009, signing up to be a member. The Computer Arts Society was founded by 3 individuals who had been involved in computing and its related creative concepts for some time, including John Lansdowne, who was an architect and pioneer of early CAD, computer-aided drawing techniques. And he was also interested in computing applications for ballet and dance choreography. Here's a picture that appeared in the BBC and also in the newspapers from 1969, showing him in his studio with some dancers from the Royal Ballet School, reading the printout of the Banish dance notations that would have come out of the teletype there. So that was John Lansdowne. The other of the trio of Computer Arts Society was the cybernetician George Mallon, who worked with Gordon Pask on the colloquy of mobiles at Cybernetics Serendipity, which you can see here. This was a large-scale sculptural installation that reacted to and learned from its various components. And it used concepts of behavior and process, interdependence, cooperation, and adaptability, all of which come from the science of cybernetics. And the third person involved with CAS was, of course, Alan Sutcliffe, who it was originally his idea. He was an ICL programmer, and he collaborated with the composer Peter Zinoviev and Electronic Music Studios, whose computers studio we saw at Cybernetics Serendipity a minute ago. He also produced poetry, and this is one of his poems called Likeness, which he made for a concert of electronic music at the Queen Elizabeth Hall in February 1967, wherein a computer was placed on the stage and played all of the music for that particular evening. Again, you can see the teletype there. So each one of these printouts of the poem was totally unique and different, and they were never repeated because that's the way the code had been set up to run. Printouts of these poems were given out at the Event 1 exhibition, which I'll mention in a moment, and were also translated into Serbo-Croat and sent to Zagreb, which I think our colleague Jonathan Bentham will probably mention later on. Well, it's worth bearing in mind that the complexity and rarity of computers during this period meant that any art form based around them was bound to be a specialist branch of art, highly dependent upon support and funding to exist. And this was not least, of course, because of the expensive, large-scale nature of much early equipment and the resulting technical expertise that was required to operate it. Again, this type of technology was not originally invented with any artistic use in mind, and therefore required a leap of faith on the part of artists. Gustav himself worked with people at Imperial College who had a large computer. So before the onset of user-friendly systems and proprietary software and personal computers, artists had to build relationships with scientists or learn to write code and construct their own hardware. And here you can see the English artist Colin Sheffield on my right here, working with 2 technicians at Time Sharing Limited to produce a drawing. This is a computer plotter drawing coming out, and there are a few more on the wall. CAS has been described as like an iceberg, only a small portion of it was visible. Within the membership, there was a great deal of technical expertise, knowledge, talent, and history. And the society was an important node of contact for a very dispersed international membership. Well, by 1971, there were 377 individual members in 17 countries and branches operating in Holland and the United States. Just to give you an idea of some of Metzger's fellow members at the time, his contemporaries, the Polish emigre Edward Ignatowicz, who we saw very briefly created that piece in the Cybernetics Serendipity slide. He took the crucial component of kinetic art, the aspect of spectator participation, and he combined it with a cybernetic principle of feedback. And here you can see him working in the mechanical engineering department at University College London on his great interactive robotic work, the Senster. This was subsequently installed at the Philips Science Center in Holland. He was almost like an early artist in residence, an artist resident in a science department. So CAS helped to foster computer art activity by providing a network of support, exhibition opportunities, workshops, events, lectures, and even on occasion funding. Their inaugural exhibition was called Event 1 and held at the Royal College of Art in March 1969. It was interdisciplinary and included participants from the realms of architecture, fine art, computer programming, and filmmaking, among others, and offered a range of visitor experiences from sculpture and graphics to live performance and workshops. As a collaboration of artists and programmers, it was to forecast the future activities of CAS. This is the poster for it. It was very well equipped. It included computers that were on loan from Imperial College of Science and Technology. And there were demonstrations of light pens and other computer-aided design applications. They also borrowed teletype terminals and graph plotters from Time Sharing Limited, commercial companies. And they had a telephone link to Zinovьev's PDP-8, which was that computer we saw at Cybernetics Serendipity. This computer was located in his studio at his house in Putney, and at the time was the only computer in a private house in Britain. There were performances and readings of computer-generated poetry, demonstrations and discussions in the theater over 2 days. And this was in addition to screenings of computer-animated film and general exhibits of computer graphics and machines on view throughout the space. Here you can see some graphic pieces of art on the walls. It was very well attended, about 700 people throughout the weekend. Metzger wrote that the combination of fine art with working equipment represented, quote, the major collective step forward and was nothing less than a revolution in the British art world. And Metzger showed his metal model for the 5 screens proposal at event 1. He also collaborated with Dr. Beverly Rowe from the University of London Computing Centre, and they managed to produce several computer plotter drawings of the project, although the goal of actually simulating the monument in operation eluded them, which was simply due to the primitive digital tools available at that time. But the 5 screens project can really be seen as the embodiment of his autodestructive theories. Autodestructive art was his answer to how artists are to respond to rapid technological change and the relationship of science to society. Metzger was terrified about modern nuclear war, so how to justify making art under these conditions? Well, autodestructive art provided the answer because 1, it avoided the art market, 2, it used techniques of contemporary life like computers and machinery, and 3, it helped the public to develop an understanding of the dire situation by devising new, peaceful, non-aggressive ways of being. Well, a post-mortem session for event 1 was held on the 3rd of April at the British Computer Society, London, at which Metzger presented a paper, Notes on the Crisis in Technological Art. And he delivered a plea for CAS to make a policy statement on the role of computers in war and the control of individual freedom. But the activities of CAS members demonstrate that from the beginning, they understood that computing innovations would fundamentally affect humanity. One of CAS's stated aims was to provide a forum in which artists and scientists could jointly work out those implications. Much of these arguments found their way into the CAS published Bulletin page, which commenced in the wake of Event 1 in April 1969. And here you see page 1. At the invitation of the CAS co-founder Alan Sutcliffe, Metzger became the first editor, and he edited the publication to 1972. Metzger asked Alan, how big is this journal going to be? And Sutcliffe said, well, there is only enough money to print 1 page. Well, there is your name, said Metzger. So it was named Page. Page is also a pun on the technical concept of paging, which is a computer term at the time introduced on the Ferranti Atlas computer, which is the use of a disk memory as a virtual store. So it was also a kind of geeky technical pun there as well, Page. Page featured the work of major British and international computer artists, as well as hosting fundamental discussions as to the aims and nature of computer art. And Metzger was the first artist to actively remind members of the potential dangers of technology, warning against any alignment with corporations that might manipulate the direction of the society. His position certainly challenged those advocates of the utopian possibilities of the coming digital age. He saw computer art as having a vast potential, but he recognized the responsibility of the artist in using such equipment. He was very aware of what he called the central and irresolvable dilemma of technological art, that the origins of much computing technology grew out of predominantly war-orientated projects. Within recent memory at this time, of course, was the Cuban Missile Crisis and the still raging Vietnam War. These ideas of Metzger's culminated in a 2-page essay for page number 11, where Metzger lists every single article that he can find that had appeared in the main professional journals of the day, the main trade journals of the day, computing and technology equipment journals, that exposed links between computers and weapons of mass destruction. As Simon Ford has pointed out, for Metzger, these references and the quotations that he wrote underneath also provided ample proof that the development of computers and armaments were both closely integrated with the capitalist economy. We must remember that CAS was linked to the British Computing Society, its parent, and indeed its funder. So there were close ties between the artists and the trade body, which was the British Computer Society. However, CAS did not take sides. Rather, it attempted to reach a medium, allowing for cooperation between disciplines, access to expertise and equipment, and at the same time encourage personal expression whilst attempting dissemination. And in several papers, including 2 published in Studio International in 1969, Metzger called for artists to align themselves with scientists who were fighting the system from within, such as the British Society for Social Responsibility in Science, whose president Maurice Wilkins had worked on the Manhattan Project, and the Union of Concerned Scientists. Also in Page, he calls for, and I will read from 375 from Matteo's book, all artists willing to prostitute their functions in this way, all artists who use the title of avant-garde to help conserve the old elite, all artists who refuse to join in attacking the present system are shit. He joined the Committee of 100, and this brochure and indeed this leaflet here were found in his studio. They are from his own personal collection, which was an anti-war group set up in 1960 with 100 signatures, including the philosopher Bertrand Russell. And in 1960, Pat Aerosmith, co-founder of CND, wrote an article for Peace News about visiting one of Metzger's lectures demonstrations. So it was possible to see autodestructive art as having a role in countering the aggression that Metzger saw inherent in the world. Now, again, due to its association with the computing world through the British Computer Society, CAS was able to exhibit at a number of computer industry trade shows. And these initiatives were more than a decade in advance of similar activities of ACM SIGGRAPH in the United States. As this type of art was outside the mainstream of British art at this time, pioneers of computer art largely had to look for venues other than traditional art galleries. Thus, trade fairs became important sites for exhibiting in the early 70s. And the trade fairs were happy to have the artists because it showcased the technology and it made it look good. These aspects of the CAS work tended to consist of displays of mostly wall-mounted computer graphics. I'll show you a photograph in a minute, as well as a program of speakers and often publication of essays in conference proceedings. Now, for Computer 70, which was held in September 1970, CAS was invited by the organizers to produce something artistic. So they made a collaborative work called the Eco Game, and that's what you're looking at up here. This was a simulation model of an economic system and the first multimedia interactive gaming system in the UK. It subsequently was exhibited at Davos at the International Forum. The Eco Game also was installed in the Science Museum in 1975, making it the first and perhaps the fastest work of British digital art to enter a museum. You can also see on view here at Computer 70 was another work by Colin Sheffield, whom we saw earlier on working with the technicians. Here he is with a giant wall-mounted plotter, which had tubes that sprayed paint onto a canvas stretched on the wall. Again, he wrote code, lines of code, which indicated how the plotter bars were supposed to move and spray the paint. And it's probably the largest plotter in the world at the time. At Computer Graphics 70 at Brunel University, Metzger showed plans for 5 screens and produced a paper about it in conference proceedings, which is reproduced again in Matteo's book and is very, very well worth reading. Here you can see another view of that exhibition. And right here, although it's a very poor slide, I apologize, you can see Metzger's design for the 5 screens. And this is some text, I believe, referring to it as well. And this is another diagram showing the 5 screens. Part of this diagram was reproduced in the Cybernetics Serendipity publication, which only had 4, but here you can see all 5 of the screens here. So he was putting forth some of his ideas. And then next to here, we have an article written by somebody else about simulation. So this is how these exhibitions often looked, paneled displays of work in progress. Now, towards the end of Metzger's life, the Computer Art Society was also able to help fund one of Metzger's last projects called Null Object, Gustav Metzger Thinks About Nothing, of 2012. And this was a collaboration with London Fieldworks, which is a duo of artists, Bruce Gilchrist and Joe Jolson. And they first met Metzger through a CAS event that he attended. Metzger always remained cognizant of the latest technological developments, and he participated in CAS meetings when the society was revived around 2003. Well, for this project, Null Object, a computer-brain interface was linked with industrial manufacturing technology to create a 3D sculpted object. Using bespoke software, the artists hooked up Gustav Metzger and recorded his brain waves on an EEG, and whilst he attempted to think about nothing. And this was translated into instructions for a manufacturing robot, which carved out the shape from the interior of a 50-centimeter cube of fossilized stone to create a void space. Gustav's willing participation created existence out of absence in the form of a virtual positive object, which was then used to create the void. So this is the data that was read from the brain waves, was fed into a computer software program, and it produced this virtual object, which only exists on the computer. And then a manufacturing robot was able to translate that into to carve that, the inside of that. So the interior of this, the void, this is what it would look like as a positive, if that makes sense. It's kind of hard to get your head around. But with Metzger's typically thoughtful, critical stance, Null Object presented a challenge to the present climate of technological evolution and increasing cybernetic augmentation. He offered an alternative model for a creative, non-invasive interface between body, mind, and machine. Like others in the CAS, Metzger was unafraid to show work in progress or experimental work, as he wished to facilitate cooperation and sharing of knowledge and resources, which is very much what the CAS is all about in the past and still is very much to this day, the idea of open resource and sharing of knowledge. However, this position has put him at odds very much with the mainstream art world. And by that I mean the interrelated network of artist and dealer and auction house and gallery museum that is the foundation of the capitalist art world. In the main, Metzger didn't deliver work that was easily collected, traded, or purchased. In fact, he called, and I quote, "autodestructive art is an assault on the dealer's system," end quote. His emphasis on a public art, like the 5 screens, was actively in order to direct the movement away from the dealer's system. Because of this, Metzger intentionally existed largely outside of the art market for most of his life. And we've heard a little bit about his art strike in the late 70s. He believed that a readjustment of the whole system was required and that the action of artists could bring this about. He realized that computer art might not be very marketable and that dealers, for a variety of reasons, were not that interested in it. But he put forward an alternative system that relies on artists' cooperation with one another, sharing and pooling resources, and forging alliances with scientists who are fighting the system. These are all activities of CAS. And because conventional art history has tended to be biased towards this interrelated relationship of dealer-gallery network, and autodestructive art is an attack on this capitalist system, Metzger's computer art has tended to be overlooked by histories of this period. But I think that from the wealth of material that he published, we can clearly see that Metzger's use of the computer, whether as a metaphor or as an actual art material, was an essential means of coming to grips with his childhood trauma and of locating a place for himself and his practice amongst the post-war, technologically dominated world that he found himself in. Many of his ideas, of course, are now common in much digital artwork today. Something's up here, I'm gonna get rid of that. There. The idea of art as a system that incorporates both the work of the work and the spectator participant as an integral element. And of course, we can see his ideas have come to the fore, concern about the environment, issues of press freedom, fake news, and so on. The relationship of science and technology to society are questions that we are still confronting today, particularly as we move into a new cyber age defined by free market economics, dominated by big business, and issues concerning use of data, questions of accountability, and privacy. And I'm going to add increasingly artificial intelligence. So I'm going to leave it there, but if you're interested in any more of this aspect of early computer arts, you can consult either of these books. And I've got a lot of information also on my website, lots of papers and articles that are open access. Thank you very much. Should we move?
Hello.
Hello?
Great work. And
We're good.
thank you, Catherine, for such a great talk. I really enjoyed the drawing the entire scope and where it comes into the Gustav's interest into computers and its use in the making of art. One of the things which was really interesting to see was and what we'll be discussing throughout the entire 3 days was how Gustav always tried to frame himself within the great tendencies of the day. For instance, at the moment of kinetic art, when he's not invited to the show, he will do a piece outside and write about kinetic art. And he did the same thing with the idea of cybernetics and saying this is the use that I will have within the that is thoughts about cybernetics. And what you've done is really greatly illustrate that. I think it's really hard to where to begin because everything was there. Everything was there.
A lot of material.
Yeah.
And quickly.
It was interesting because indeed one of the key moments for Gustav's development was the idea was This Is Tomorrow, which he went to visit numerous times back then, and he even did a show, one of his very very early shows, at 30 Queens, where he had gone to London and went to see the show again and stole, as far as I understand, all of the posters of the of the show. And what he decided to do, which I thought was brilliant, was then to cover the entire windows of his shop with these posters.
Yes, it's a shame that no photographs survive of that.
No, not at all. But all of the posters that he stole, though, survived.
Okay.
Yeah, and we had they're now all at Tate.
Great.
And it was great because when we reproduced that show, a couple of years ago, in a show that I curated in London, and so we to give ourselves an idea, we reproduced the entire posters that he had. Great collection of them, actually several were duplicates, and obliterated the windows like that. But what I really loved about that was that here is a man with a shop that he needs to run to make a living, and completely withdrawing the viewer from seeing inside but seeing the art. So I thought that was great early appropriation show. But I had no idea that this was one of the first moments when the user computer arises, though.
Absolutely, it's very exciting to find that. I was very very excited to find that. When I started my research back in 2002. As I don't have a background in computing at all, I have a traditional art history background. So to come across, I thought, well, when's the first time that artists talk about this? And to come across that was very exciting. But the irony, of course, is that they're drawing it out by hand, having typed it. I think wonderful.
And do you know if that show was also important for the other members that are going to create the Computer Art Society later?
Yes, absolutely. Many people saw that exhibition. It was very important, and it led right into Cybernetics Serendipity. You can trace a line from Richard Hamilton particularly, who went on, he did stuff like Man, Machine, and Motion, other exhibitions as well. He did an exhibition, Growth and Form, which was based on Darcy Wentworth Thompson's book on growth and form. Particularly through Richard Hamilton, because he goes on to teach, and one of his students is Roy Ascott. One of Roy Ascott's students is Stephen Willits and Stroud Cornick, who then go on to teach the next generation. So it literally, there's a direct link. I traced a direct link from, if you like, master pupil, if you want to use the old-fashioned art historical term, or tutor student, right through from 1956, when it was very first written about, but nobody could find any, right to 1972 at the Slade School of Art, when Stephen Scrivener, the very first artist in an art school in Britain, was actually able to get his hands on a computer in an art school. And he made art with it, and he got his PhD based on that type of art.
Oh, that's really interesting.
He was the second person to gain, second artist in Britain to gain a PhD. Because before that, there was no mechanism set up for gaining PhDs for artists. You could only go as far as getting like a secondary certificate.
Right.
And the first artist was a kinetic artist who got his PhD. And then Stephen Scrivener started it first, but he didn't finish until a bit later on. But anyway, those two first PhDs, and they were both about 1971, 72, were by artists using technological equipment, kinetic art and computing and technology of the present day. And of course, this was a way that the exam boards who awarded the PhDs could actually go about finding a mechanism to give an artist a research degree, because technology was seen as something, computing, that you could do research with. Whereas painting, how are you going to know if that's making any? It was too difficult to quantify,
right?
Of course, nowadays, the years have gone by and we have mechanisms in place. But I thought it was very interesting for me to discover that that's how the very first artists were able to gain qualifications at a very much higher level. Because the exam board, they were able to prove basically to the exam boards that they had done something new, that they had used, that they were breaking new ground, new research, because they're using computing.
Right. That's interesting. And also, I'd like to focus a little our talk really with the idea of page now. And also what we can talk about is when you mentioned the idea of university, is how universities became a playground for Gustav as well at that time. But let's begin first of all with Alan Sutcliffe, that I had the great pleasure to meeting through you, and I'm very grateful to you for the introduction. Can you tell me how he met Gustav, or did you ever mention that with Alan? The very early moments?
Well, I think that the meeting came through Dr. Beverly Rowe. Beverly Rowe was a member of the British Computer Society, which is now called they've renamed themselves now the Chartered Institute for IT, and that makes a lot more sense because they are basically the trade body for computer professionals, okay? So if you were a programmer like Alan Sutcliffe, he was what we would nowadays call in the research and development department of ICL. In those days, they didn't have such terminology, but he was involved in finding out new things about computers. So Dr. Beverly Rowe was likewise a computer programmer, and the two of them would have known each other at the British Computer Society, which is why the CAS was set up as a little subgroup of the British Computer Society, because Alan had an in that way, and it was a way that they could find a framework for setting up this art society. And there were other arts, there were other societies. There was a society for education, and there was a society for different things. So there are numerous subsets within this, which were all run by volunteers, but the Computer Art Society was much the biggest one. And I think Beverly Rowe apparently knew Gustav from Kingsland.
Yeah, he did indeed. Yeah.
So I think I think it came through there. So that's how Alan would have got to know him.
Yeah,
and they were just starting out and they wanted someone to do the thing. And so Gustav said, yes, I'll do it. And I really like the story about, well, what are you going to call this publication? Well, I don't know. We've only got one page. We have no money. We'll just call it Page, which I think is a really brilliant title. Plus, it happens to be a kind of a nerdy pun on paging as a computer term to do with memory.
Oh, and as you see, and when you look into all the writing that Gustav would produce during Page, there's loads of humor within that.
Absolutely, and irony, and sometimes it's quite hard to tell how serious he's being, but there was a playful side, I think, too.
There was, yeah, which was really interesting when we were making the book. Actually, we sat down with Gustav to try to highlight which one. It was really hard to tell at some point what was his writing and what was not.
Yes.
And the decision we came to really was to of course take the sign writing, which is the obvious one.
Sure.
To try to see which one would have been a creative writing of it on his behalf, but also to try to choose elements which he thought was so important that they ought to be reproduced.
Yes, because of course, being the editor, he would have had control over whatever anybody sent in. But having said that, I've been told by numerous pioneers from that time that the Computer Art Society operated a very broad sort of basis. Almost anything that was submitted within reason was accepted. They did not turn anything down, and that was part of their ethos was about sharing, cooperation, about wide distribution networks. So, unless something was massively obscene, and I don't think there was ever an example of that, basically anyone could send anything in, whatever they wanted. There was virtually no kind of censorship of any sort.
Yeah.
And this was deliberate because at that time it was felt that this was a new methodology and we should try and explore its possibilities to the limit, really.
Right, to be all-encompassing as well.
Absolutely.
I think it's really interesting that you mentioned Beverly Rowe, that we spoke about with Ivor yesterday, because Beverly was the one who read the Matunus Manifesto during DIAS. And he had met Gustav when he was a student in Cambridge, when Gustav used to come to Cambridge with his stall, and he bought books from him.
Okay.
And then went to Cambridge.
All right, so that ties up nicely.
But what was interesting, and that comes back to your talk now, which is, I'm grateful to see the 5 screen with computers to the size which they would
I know,
have
it's
been
really lovely, isn't it?
Because also one of the reasons when I did a discussion lately with Beverly about their work together, the working process, because really Beverly accompanied Gustav throughout the mid-60s with the development of that idea. And he was telling me that the main problem they had was they could not imagine how the screens could keep on breaking without the top bit falling.
Yes.
So if the middle break down, everything had to break down.
Of course,
So they were trying to figure out solutions. And And one of the things that Beverly told me lately was that he was working really hard for even one, trying to find a first modelization of 5-screen with computer,
Yes.
but not succeeding, unfortunately.
Yes. I mean, that would have been very interesting to see us. I mean, nowadays we would easily make a simulation, an animation that would show the whole thing being constructed and falling apart and how it would work and da-da. And I like the way that Gustav talks about the people who lived there would be given devices that they could interact with. That's like that must be a prescient reference to a smartphone, surely. You know, get out your iPad and you can, you know, find out what's going on, you know, and communicate with it. And he did talk also about using the computing power that would run this massive installation. When it wasn't being run, people could maybe use it to tap into libraries. Well, that's the internet.
Yeah.
Isn't it? So he felt that there was a way that when the computer wasn't being used for the actual artworks functioning, that the residents could somehow make use of that computing power. And of course, the concept of that would have dawned on him because of this time sharing thing. So I showed you that slide of time sharing with Colin Sheffield, because it's a really good slide because it's got the technician sitting there and the artist, so it really illustrates my point nicely. But the point about time sharing, that was the title of the company, was that during the day it ran programs for companies. So you could send your payroll out, you could send calculations out. If you had to do some kind of mathematical or economic thing to do with whatever it was your business was on a commercial sense, you would send it out and time sharing would run it and give you the numbers back. So artists had to access this equipment on the weekends or out of hours. They literally had to share the time and fit themselves in between the main business, which was of course business, running, you know, business. So Gustav would have totally understood this idea of having to make use of the 24-hour period that the computer was running. I mean, we just take this for granted now. We expect to tap into the Wi-Fi and boom, it's immediately there, don't we? But this idea of having to buy time on a computer is quite an interesting phenomenon, which was very pertinent at the time. Artists would have to line up, they'd have to queue up, they'd have to book in advance. I mean, I had stories of people telling me they slept the night on the floor. You know, they'd bring in a blanket and a pillow because, you know, they were running their program through the middle of the night. That was the only time that the companies would let them in to use the computers. And of course, you didn't dare go home having set it in motion, because you would come back in the morning and find that the whole thing had, you know, had a fault somewhere. You know, there was an error code. So they would sleep there at night in the actual, you know, sleep there. And then if there was anything wrong, they could get up quickly, fix it, rewrite the code, adjust it, make adjustments, run the thing again, go back to sleep. And this way they would not waste any of their time. It was out of hours, out of business office hours.
That's great, thank you. And the last question I have for you before opening it to the floor is, I really enjoyed when you showed us the biggest plotter at the time.
Yes.
Because of course it made me think of Gustav's use of the plotter, and especially, and what I was struck by by the image that you've showed, who was the artist again? I'm sorry.
Colin Sheffield.
Colin Sheffield. Because the form that were on a canvas was so close to the one that Gustav actually experimented himself.
Yes.
And that I thought was really striking.
Yes, this one is slightly different in that it's a pen that is pressing on the thing. So that's a slightly different technique. Whereas this, Colin Sheffield actually had spray paint coming out. This must have been quite difficult to control. Apparently it leaked and, you know, there was all kinds of problems. And he, in fact, poor Colin, he did give it up. This 1970, that picture is such a super photograph because it was taken by the press. He appeared on the BBC with this equipment. Because, you know, this stuff was considered novelty and was interesting, and so the press would turn up and have a look. A couple of years after this, I think by about 72, he'd given up the whole use of computer and went back to actual painting.
Do you know if, for instance, it worked with Gustav on his plotter pieces or not at all?
No, they didn't. There was no collaboration there. But they would have talked at meetings. They knew each other very much. They all knew each other. I mean, I must say that, you know, we talk about a society, we think of it as being, you know, kind of very, but, you know, it's a loose grouping of artists with some of whom have very differing viewpoints and differing approaches to the use of technology. And they would come together for exhibitions or for events or for conferences. You know, I was told how people would meet up occasionally, like once or twice a year, and they'd come across, and they would have discussions about something which would inform something else. Or they would find that they each had something in common and they would go off and have a little collaboration. And so it's a loose and fluid grouping, I suppose, of people who have an interest in computers. Not all of them would have called themselves computer artists. I use that term for specific reasons, but some people preferred not to use that term at all. In fact, Page hosted numerous debates as to what should this movement be called, how can we define it. You know, I want to call myself a computer artist. I do not want to call myself a computer artist. Why are we using the term computer at all? We should just be artists. It doesn't matter. We don't call ourselves oil paint. Did the oil painters call themselves oil painters? You know, so there's lots and lots of debates into the 70s and 80s about this. And indeed, it's still happening because a lot of people in the digital art world don't like to see their art lumped together with a digital art show. They just want to see an art show that happens to have some digital art in it.
Yeah, fair enough. And the other thing which is really striking that when you think about the pairing between Gustav and Alan was, of course, the interview that they conducted together with Buckminster Fuller.
Yes, and I think that's marvelous that you have put that in the book, because that is not something that is that easy to find and not in that form.
Yeah, well, no, it was great when we discovered it with Alan in his archive, and really and also the questions that well, we will come back to some of the points later on with Andrew, I'm sure, but his research and his knowledge of Fuller's work, but also his criticism is just magnificent. But I'd like to see there again, to have Alan Sutcliffe, the umbrella of Computer Art Society, this channeling a discussion with three great minds.
Absolutely. And you know, I mean, I've only met him, you know, from about the year 2003 onwards, but he turned up to almost every Computer Art Society event. He was just, you know, he came, he visited, you know, and he might sit quietly in the corner or he might participate, but you know, he used to turn up to a lot of things, which I think is, you know, heartening.
Okay, let's open to the floor. Niels? Yeah. Hang on, you gotta have the mic because I can't hear. Wait. No, but still can't hear.
Mentioned the stated destruction of art, the Protestant destruction of, let's say, sculptures. But I have a question concerning the question of Britishness. How comfortable Gustav felt with being member of the British Computer Art Society, he as a migrant, and this nationalism, which for me is in the word, and with this emphasis on British.
Well, I think we need to point out, first of all, that it was the Computer Arts Society. The term Britain did not come into the art part, but so CAS was Computer Arts, plural, and Alan Sutcliffe was very strong about stressing the arts, plural, because he wanted everything: poetry, dance, performance, not just visual art. Now, the parent was the British Computer Society, which was the trade body for people engaged in the profession of computing in Britain. But the Computer Arts Society was actually separate from the BCS. I mean, I did mention obviously that it's its parent, and therefore we need to sort of remember that relationship, but they did consider themselves separate. You do not have to be a member. In fact, to this day, you do not have to be a member of the BCS to belong to CAS. You know, they consider themselves separate and have autonomy. And, you know, we still have control over our own budget and all the rest of it. And I think the international thing was quite important. And if you look at, I mean, I did show a slide of a leaflet, a blue leaflet, which was not, you can't read that from, you know, blown up like that. But it does talk about the international aspect. And if you look at the issues of Page, which a lot of them are now in here, thankfully, and the rest of them are in fact, all of them are on PDFs on the Computer Arts Society website, which I highly recommend you look up. Just put Computer Arts Society into Google and you'll get it. And you can download each issue of Page right back from Gustav's very first one as a PDF and print them out if you like and read them. They're very, very high resolution. If you look through those, you'll see that they're constantly talking about what people in America are doing, people in Japan are doing, what are the Germans up to? You know, Frieder Naka, a great German pioneer of digital art, constantly writing into Page, coming over to England, giving discussions. We're going to hear shortly about how some of the British contingent went to Zagreb for a big symposium there. People would send things overseas. Indeed, people from Europe and Japan and America sent things to Britain for exhibitions.
And so, also, some of the issues were edited by people from abroad.
Completely. And Barbadillo, Manuel Barbadillo is a good example. South America, he edited an entire issue. Some of those slides that I showed of the kind of the panels with things, graphics stuck to them, and at event one, those would have been people sending things in from South America or somewhere. Now, when I started the research into this in 2003, we found that, because I would go around and speak to people, as you find too, that people are bringing things out of the woodwork here. And suddenly we discovered all of this stuff that George Mallon had kind of kept custodianship of in an old plan chest, literally two-dimensional flat pieces on plotter drawings, mostly on paper. And these were things that had been sent from overseas for exhibitions, which were just then left.
Right.
Because, they didn't have this huge value. This is why I mentioned the kind of dealer kind of emphasis on the art market. So, if you'd sent something of yours from Germany, you didn't bother to ask for it back or go and collect it. You just sort of thought, well, I'll just, it's gone to the... So vast piles of this stuff. I mean, there were 2,000 items that we put together and donated to the Victorian Albert Museum, which now forms the National Center for Computer Art. And subsequent to that, of course, other collections have also gone into the V&A, and it's a vast center of computer art there now.
Christine, please.
Thank you for an absolutely fantastic
thank you,
talk.
Christine. I appreciate that.
Really, really marvelous and insightful. I especially loved the beginning on Kingsland and where that was just marvelous. Thank you. But my question is, did you have the opportunity to speak with Metzger about his process of thinking about nothing and what he actually, how he managed to think? Because the three-dimensional model looks like he was thinking quite a bit.
Well, yes, and in fact, I didn't have time to kind of go into that very much. There is a bit
I'm
more.
eager to hear about it more.
There is a bit more online about this project, which didn't receive a huge amount of publicity, although it was exhibited at Kettle's Yard, Cambridge, and it was exhibited. Okay, yeah. So there is some stuff. Yeah. And the other thing I must point out to you, and I made a note here which I didn't have time to mention, that Null Object is, again, it's a bit like the term page that we talked about. Page was a pun, a kind of geeky pun on the use of virtual memory store at the time. Again, that term is no longer useful in computing nowadays, needless to say. But Null Object is also a pun on a computing term, again. And the two artists duo, the London Field, they call themselves London Fieldworks, who put this work together, were very aware that it's a kind of a coding device, a null object. That, and I'm not a programmer, so I'm not going to explain it well. But it's within programming languages, you can have a null. You can write a null object into a code program to represent an object that has no referenced value or with defined neutral null behavior. So for example, you might have a list of unknown length of a list of people or a list of objects of unknown length. And so you can put a null object, be put in there as a piece of code. It's a coding device. So there's also a pun on that. And indeed, if you read the book again, there is a whole section in 2002 in Lisbon, I believe.
Concepts of nothing. Yeah.
Yes, Metzger had started thinking about the concept of nothing from 2002. What's that? No. Oh, yeah.
Oh, you're gonna love it.
Well, there's a wealth of fabulous material in here, but it tells you a little bit more about the idea of nothing. And Metzger put, he kind of looked up how many references in the British Library there were to the concept of nothing, and so. But clearly, a person can't really think about nothing because one's thoughts are always going through. So it's interesting that depending on the person who was hooked up to the machine, a completely different virtual sculptural object would appear. I mean, mine would look completely different from Metzger's. I did not, sadly, no. But there is a book that has, a small catalog that's been produced about this that does talk a bit more about it. But I wasn't involved in that project, unfortunately.
There's also one of the things which is striking about that project, which I don't know if it's relevant or not, but is to see Gustav at that age doing that.
Absolutely.
So that's also
absolutely, and
both moving and
London Fieldworks, the two artists involved with who set it up, they met him at a CAS event. They got talking. They didn't know who he was or they got talking to him. They discovered what a fascinating character he was. They were interested in autodestructive art. They're younger generation, and they wanted to work with him, and so they persuaded him to work with him.
Right. And the other thing which is fascinating, to go back to Page, was not only was it a means for him to write and to express his own ideas, but also to become an art form and really to make some works of art in the old traditional sense somehow. For instance, this one is I guess one of my favorite pieces Gustav ever made, which is just tragic, it's terrible. How many Western digits to delete? these Asian digits. It's terrible, it's hard, it's powerful, it's just one line at it and it tells it all. And that's the back cover of one of the issues of Page. Anyone would like to join? Ivor, please. Hang on, hold on, still microphone.
Sorry.
Microphone.
Oh, yes. I'm still trying to form a question because I found that so fascinating and so enlightening.
Oh, thank you.
To me particularly, to see, and what occurred to me was the sort of evolution of computer art. And it seemed to me that it evolved from a period and a time when, I don't know how to describe it. It wasn't really totally computerized. It was, people were making marks, they were sending stuff. I don't know if you know Jorge Glusberg, if you remember, he was one of the first people from Argentina to send these things through the post.
Absolutely. And you know, there's a history, which I didn't have time to go into, of a programmatic way of thinking.
Yeah.
Before person could ever, it has origins in constructivism, it has origins in Bauhaus. Before people could ever get a hold of anything, there's a programmatic way of thinking, of arranging a rules-based how to produce art.
That's just what you formulated that part of the question that I wanted to ask. And I feel that thinking about Gustav's involvement in this, he was of that time, it seems to me, because he wasn't, I mean, to be realistic, he was no more slick with a computer than I am.
Nor me.
And whenever I saw a performance of Gustav's, and I'm not running him down by saying this, the contrary, he would spend, for example, a very long time laying out one piece of equipment, I don't know what they were, and another object, which looked like laying some extraordinary surrealist table of stuff. And people would wait for perhaps an hour. And in the end, it didn't work. I mean, honestly, and I say it positively, people enjoyed it.
Yeah, well,
they enjoyed the anticipation.
But
people were tickled to death with it.
It's that spirit, isn't it? A spirit of experimentalism.
Yeah.
You know, which I think very much marks the early days of the Computer Arts Society.
Yes.
You know, let's try things. And this was the 1960s, where there was a freeing up of conventions and an overlapping of disciplines, and people have told me how they felt a sense of freedom, you know, that they could sort of try something else, and it didn't matter if you hadn't been to art school, or it didn't matter if you hadn't been to programming, you know, you didn't know mathematics or logic, because you could pair up with someone who did.
Yes.
You know, and so this is the whole point about creating a society with people who, the founders, came from a wide variety of disciplines. We had a programmer, Alan Sutcliffe. We had an architect, John Lansdowne. We had a cybernetician and a creative thinker, George Mallon. And that kind of fed throughout the whole of the history of the Computer Arts Society. And I hope it still exists to this day.
That's clear. Exactly what I was trying to say, to ask you, actually. And indeed, he's gone. Gustav went a sort of all the way then to having help when he had his liquid crystals done up by technicians, which you'd have never done otherwise. I mean, it's wonderful. And the ideas that he had at that time, of course, were great, but they did not exist in the sort of material reality as we know it.
Well, a lot of this art doesn't exist, and indeed, a lot of this art only exists in photographs. That picture of
or text,
or absolutely, or text, which is what's so important. Because you know, they repurposed equipment, they reused it. Something that started life as something, one thing, ended up life as another thing, because this equipment was expensive, it was difficult to come by. So you just, you know, reused it and recycled it into your next project, or it got discarded. And a lot of it was considered ephemeral. It wasn't really considered important to keep. And you know, I'm always struggling with trying to find photographs, because I mean, nowadays it's just everywhere. There's constant photography going on. We walk around with cameras in our pockets all the time. But you know, it's not, I mean, it's 50 years ago, it's not that long ago, but very few people took any photographs. I have like 3 pictures of event 1, which
Right.
was their very first event. It would have been extremely exciting. People were very excited about it. And there were 3 photographs surviving.
But a great catalog, though.
But a very good
Yeah.
catalog, yeah.
But talking of photographs, I love that little display of Gustav's 5-screen with computer. I'd never seen that before.
Yes.
And knowing Gustav, I can imagine that he would have been there to put it there.
Oh,
To
completely.
agree, at least.
And the model, the metal model definitely made.
So that was great to see. Anybody would like to join us? Andrew, please.
Right, pass. Awesome. That was really great, Catherine.
Oh,
Thank you so much. I think sort of following on from what Ivor was saying, I'm finding it difficult to formulate a question as well, but it's more a kind of thoughts really about the relationship between, and I'm sure this will come out with Jonathan later as well, the relationship between Gustav and his ideas of science and technology and computers, and Gustav and actually practically using them. Because I think one of the things that you brought out so brilliantly was this sense of that there was a sort of, there was both an engagement, obviously with the ideas critically, but a kind of a distance from actually hands-on equipment. And that's something, a sort of tension that you find working through Gustav's life pretty much all the way through.
That's very, very interesting.
And that's that sense in which, you know, he formulates his art very much in a kind of conceptual realm, pretty much again all the way through. And I think one can almost think of his attitude to painting earlier as well, very much in that sort of way. And I just wondered if.
Yeah, no, I would agree completely with that observation. I think that's yeah, very valuable to think about it like that. Absolutely.
That's kind of why I was wondering about what he was thinking about with nothing. That's why I was wondering about what he was thinking about with nothing.
Yeah, yeah. I don't know. Is the short answer to that.
I mean, I can just say it in my words, but Gustav stated that once, I think it was in 2008 or something, and he had a discussion in London. There was one of the audience asking, you didn't have a telephone long time. I mean, in the end, he had one. Why you are talking about telephone techniques and so on? And she said, you don't have to have the tool in your hand to think about it.
Yeah.
So
that's
I think,
a wonderful quote, isn't it? You don't have to have the tool in your hand to think about it. That's brilliant. Yeah.
And that's maybe this conceptual thing which pops up. But on the other hand, I want to pose another question, because maybe it comes up in the next talk, I don't know. But as we are also, there is also a lot of, he researched a lot of things like new ideas in plotter design. There is a text. This text, new ideas in plotter design.
Yeah. Yes, yeah, which is in here.
So, yes, where you see that he also uses this technique, the light technique, to make not even forms we see like a drawing, but he was also thinking in 3D.
Mm-hmm.
So I think this is a very interesting thing, that he uses this technique at the time where no one was thinking in 3D plotting. But he thought of it.
But also what's wonderful when he did these 2 drawings is that he did not do them.
Yes.
He asked an artist and he asked a scientist to do them for him.
Yes.
And I think that, I mean, for me, that distanciation between the artist and the work of art is of great beauty. Just, you don't need to make it for the art to be yours. And
well, not everybody got, hands down dirty with the code, so to speak, I mean, some people prefer to, work with someone else who write. And even to this day, people make immersive environments and someone else writes their code, or they use gaming software is becoming very popular to use gaming engines in multimedia video work particularly. And of course, they've not written that. It's a proprietary package that you can buy. Prior to the time of proprietary packages, off-the-shelf packages, which we're talking about, of course, you did have to learn to write code if you wanted to do it, or you'd have to find someone who you could work with. So this is why I like the example of Colin Sheffield working with those guys at Time Sharing. He told them what he wanted to achieve, and then they're helping him write the code.
well, thank you. On that note, we're going to take a small break. And gather together in about how long, Laura? In 5 minutes? In what? At 5. At 5, sorry, at 5 o'clock. And for the most anticipated talk by Jonathan Benthel. Thank you very much, Catherine. This was great.